Hello, this is the Consciousness Podcast, and I'm your host, Stuart Preston. Each episode, I have a conversation with an expert in human consciousness. In this episode, I had the honor of speaking with Dr. John Weber. Dr. Weber is a practicing psychiatrist whose patients have experienced past life regression and near-death experiences. He is also the author of the book, The Red Chair, the story of John and his patient Judy, who discovered past lives and a connection with spirituality, which led them to healing that they thought previously impossible. We discussed near-death experiences and other psi phenomena as they relate to consciousness. Please enjoy this episode with Dr. John Weber.
Dr. Weber, thank you so much for joining me. I wanted to kind of get your insight into how you see consciousness and how it works, because you've had some pretty amazing experiences. So why don't we start with that and tell us kind of the impetus behind, your book, The Red Chair, and talk to us about some of those experiences, and maybe just give a little bit of an introduction and a background for us to launch from there.
No problem, Stuart, and thank you for allowing me to be part of the conversation. I've listened to lots of your podcasts, and they're brilliant, and it's nice to be. You've had some wonderful guests, Edward Kelly and Dean.
Well, thank you.
So it's a pleasure to be here. So look, just to give you a little bit of my background, my background is obviously I'm a psychiatrist, and so my background essentially is kind of the old-fashioned medical science one. So I used to have a very firm belief that the brain was the sole source of consciousness, which I think is probably true for most doctors these days, even now. So so it was purely coming from the brain, and when we die, that's the end of it. But then I did get some, there were a number of things that sort of came into my life. My son-in-law saw a medium and told me some details of that were quite extraordinary. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. And then my daughter gave me Many Lives, Many Masters by Brian Weiss, a psychiatrist, a very established, well-credentialed psychiatrist who had an extraordinary experience with one of his patients going back into a past life. And then I just started researching and reading about psychic phenomenon and mediums and near-death experiences and reincarnation, both with regard to children and with regard to hypnosis. And it sort of took me over, to be honest. I couldn't ignore it. I had ignored it for many years when patients talked about it, and then my patients started telling me their stories, which I think I'd probably previously dismissed. So now my opinion is almost the opposite to what I previously had. And it's probably very similar to one of your recent speakers, Mark Gober, where it's completely on its head. Now I would argue that consciousness precedes matter, that there probably is one primary source of consciousness, or a universal consciousness, if you like, and that is the source of our physical being, if you like, and that it's manifest this world of form and time, including our physical bodies. So in a sense, I see it as that our brain, if you like, is the filter of that broader or universal consciousness, albeit with a narrow bandwidth, so that we only get a very limited experience based on our senses. And my feeling is that when people have those near-death experiences, or even experiences on psychedelics, for example, or under hypnosis, or psychic phenomenon, that they're somehow broadening that bandwidth and tapping into that broader consciousness, which we're normally not very aware of. So that's kind of where I'm at, and but I love the stories that go with, and I suppose that's the thing that really kind of pushed me. I had patients who started telling me stories about their own psychic experiences and if you like, visitations or whatever it was, or their near-death experiences. And that was the thing that, if you like, sort of drove me to write the book. And I'd had one patient in particular, who's called Judy in the book, And she'd had a couple of near-death experiences, and she'd been incredibly unwell for many, many years. And so I finally sort of bit the bullet and decided to do past life regression on her, to just in the hope that might help her, because she really was extraordinarily unwell, and everything we tried hadn't worked. Her response, she was a very good hypnotic subject, so her experiences were quite extraordinary, not just going into past lives, but if what we would call between lives, and then having other sort of psychic phenomena happening which were quite extraordinary, including going into the future. She'd have this sort of guide, if you like, or tapping into some sort of consciousness that would tell her about things that were going to happen, or even things related to me, and they were quite extraordinary. So for me, it's the stories that that in the end were the confirming factors. I did lots of reading, but it's the stories from patients and friends, not just patients, that inspired me to write the book, and in the hope that other people like you would explore the idea that consciousness may be more than just limited to our brains. So so that's kind of that's it in a nutshell. But I'm look, for example, I saw a new patient recently, and she came to me and said, "Oh, look, I do have weird stuff happen to me." She said, "Look, just the other day I had a dream where I dreamt that I was at the funeral of my best friend's mother." And she woke up from the dream and thought to herself, "Well, that's silly, because I know her mother's completely well." And of course, later that day, her best friend's mother died, and of course, she ended up going to the funeral. So now, in the past, I probably would have somehow dismissed that and said, "Well, that's just it's coincidence, or it's luck." But it's things like that. I mean, again, another patient I saw recently, and he'd read the book, and he said, "Look, it's extraordinary." He said, "Just the other day, I was walking down the street, and it's a fairly busy street with shops on both sides. We call it a strip shopping centre, and he was walking downhill, so it was going at a bit of a pace, and there was a woman in front of him with a pram, with a baby in the pram, and another young child in her hand, walking along. And he said, for absolutely no known reason, he suddenly grabbed her and said, 'Stop.' And he was a bit shocked with himself for doing it. But a split second later, a car raced out of a hidden laneway right in front of the pram. And there's no question that probably would have hit the pram at a minimum. And the woman suddenly turned around and said, 'Oh my God, I'm so sorry.' If anything, she should have been a bit annoyed that some man had grabbed her. But both of them were shocked, and he couldn't explain why he did it. So it's stories like.
So that's something that now you're saying there's something to that. Before, you would have thought to yourself, "Well, that's just a coincidence."
Exactly.
And so maybe talk to us. Maybe Judy. Talk to us about. What really opened your eyes to this different perspective on consciousness from what you held in the beginning? What was was it Judy was she the primary case, or was there another one that really made you start to kind of reevaluate things and see things differently?
No, in truth, it was there were two things. One, my son-in-law came to me. He's a lovely guy, Sam, and his brother had died from a brain tumor, and it was a very rapidly developing brain tumor, and he was really quite sad about it. And his brother had left him his car in his will, and the car unfortunately was a wreck. It was unrepairable, but
right.
Sam felt really sad about it, and he felt like he couldn't dispose of it because of
right.
sentimental value.
Yeah.
So his mother said, look, apparently there's this lady, Monica, who's a terrific medium. Perhaps, and his mother's a little bit interested in the psychic stuff. Sam wasn't. And Sam said, oh, okay, I'll go and do that. So he went and he anonymously rang up Monica and went and saw her, and she knew nothing about him. And when he saw Monica, the first thing she said, and I know you've interviewed death doulas before. You've interviewed Deborah Diamond, I think it was, who's a medium.
Deborah Diamond, yep, Deborah Diamond, yeah.
So this woman said, look, what they do is that they show you evidence just to let you know that they're there, that they're still around. And the first thing that she did was say, well, look, he's holding his head in his hands. And so did he die from something to do with his brain or to do with his head? And of course that was true. He died from a brain tumour. And my first thought was, well, okay, that you could get lucky. And then she described a few things about his personality, which were accurate. And I think 5 minutes in, she then said, and he's telling you to get rid of the car. Don't worry about the car. Does that make any sense to you? And of course, it made complete sense to Sam, because that was one of his primary concerns. And then I think soon after, another 5 minutes later, she said, oh, now he's saying Timmy, and he's laughing. Does that make any sense to you? And what happened was that Sam said, well, when I was a young teenager, he and my other older brother used to tease me and call me little Timmy. So it was incredibly specific. And fortunately, he had the tape, so I ended up listening to the tape because I needed to verify exactly what she'd said. So for me, that was quite profound. And then at the same time,
when that happens, and this was the first instance that made you kind of start to open your mind to a different perspective.
Exactly, Stuart. I'd up until then, patients had told me their sort of extraordinary stories, or their mystical stories, or psychic ones, and they told me about their near-death experiences, and I just had broadly dismissed it. My father-in-law, for example, a lovely man who only recently, and I'll tell you the story about him. He had a near-death experience when he was in his 30s. So he was in Glasgow in Scotland, and his little car was hit by a double-decker bus, and he had a tear in his aortic arch. So he was. It was the very early days of heart bypass, and he was written up in the Lancet because he was only the second man ever to have had Dacron used to replace his aortic arch. But while he was on the operating table with chest open and the surgeons working on his heart and his aorta, he floated out of his body and looked back down on it. And he said there was this profound sense of peace and well-being. And in his words, he said there was just a sense of no judgment. They were his words, and they've always stuck with me. And then he said it was weird because he could kind of move in any direction he wanted to just by thinking about it. And he's an engineer, so he's a very smart guy. And he remembered thinking he was looking down on the operating table and his body, and he thought to himself, well, I know this is real, as in where he was at the top of the room. And what's that down there? So there was this odd feeling that the body and the surgeons were something different. And then he started moving towards a beautiful light. But that's all. He didn't have all the features of a classic near-death experience, but they were very profound for him. And he woke up, 3 days later in the ICU with tubes coming out of everywhere. So he's written up in the Lancet, but not his near-death experience. So now he's a lovely man, but he wouldn't talk a lot about that because he didn't want people to discount it or dismiss it. And when he told me, to be honest, I was a young doctor, so I in my own mind I did dismiss it. I just thought, oh no, he's had some kind of hallucination, which is still, I think, what a lot of doctors would think today. They'd still talk about that kind of thing as being, and in fact, that frustrates me now, because I've read lots of books on near-death experiences, and I think they're clutching at straws. They still say, well, there must be some unrecordable part of the brain that's still working. And as Bernardo Kastrup would say, I think that's baloney. I don't think that.
Yeah.
I can talk a bit more about that too, because now, anyway, I'll go back to the father-in-law. So I quietly dismissed that back, and I'd had other patients with near-death experiences. And in fact, Judy had 2 near-death experiences. On one occasion, she had an illness called Guillain-Barré, which can be fatal. It causes paralysis of all of the muscles, and she ended up on a respirator. And while on the respirator and in induced coma, she floated out of her body and went up into the corner of the room and looked back down on her body being, and her chest being pumped up and down. And again, she said it just felt beautiful. It was profoundly lovely. And then she had a kind of a beautiful gold light come over her left shoulder. And it said to her, well, it's not your time yet. This is, you have to look after the kids. And what's fascinating, and she just said it was all beautiful, and she was interested because she said, I don't know why I didn't look around and to see who was talking to me, but she didn't. I think she was too busy looking at her body on the But I caught up with her again probably about 9 weeks later, when she'd finally got to the point where she could walk again, albeit with a frame, and she came into the room, and she's quite a character, which you'll get a sense of in the book, because she's quite a delight, but very colourful. And she said, well, it just didn't make sense, because he definitely said kids. And I've only got 1 kid, and I've had an endometrial ablation, so I can't have any more. And so it didn't for her quite make sense. Of course, at the time, her daughter was 16, and she was pregnant a year later. And Judy's been helping to look after the grandkids ever since. So the kids in the end did make sense. So that. Back then, when I was a young doctor, even then, when I was looking after her, somehow I still kind of dismissed it and turned it into something to do with a brain aberration or something like. She had another one as well when she took a very serious overdose and ended up having to be resuscitated. And during the resuscitation, she again floated out of her body and looked back down on it and could see them. She put it using the paddles on her to try and get her heart going again. And despite both of those, I still was happy to try and squeeze that into the old-fashioned view of brain function and see it as some form of hallucination or brain spasm. So that, in the end, that was the history. But hearing about the medium from my son-in-law, and then my daughter gave me a book called Many Lives, Many Masters. I don't know if you know about it. It was by a psychiatrist, Brian Weiss. He was the chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at Miami University. He was connected to Mount Sinai, was on a really extraordinary, academic trajectory. And he'd had a patient that he couldn't get better, and he decided as a last resort. She had all sorts of problems to do with her swallowing and a whole range of phobias. And he did hypnosis on her and took her back into her earlier life. Now that revealed a little bit of something in her earlier life, but it didn't help her. So he then did the hypnosis again, and this time he just said, "Look, go back to when your problems began." So, and all of a sudden she started talking about her life from centuries before, and talking about it in great detail with significant emotion. And I think that first one was where she was in a warlike situation, and she ended up having her throat cut at the end of her life. But what was fascinating about that was that she actually, her problems with swallowing then disappeared. So it's almost as if that, and again, it's fascinating to discuss it, the idea that something related to the consciousness of an event in a past life could impact on us in our current lives, and that's probably where people get very interested and excited about the idea of doing past life regressions, which I did as well. But Brian Weiss was very, I mean, in his book, he was dumbfounded, and he was trying to say, well, does she have schizophrenia? Does she have some other extraordinary kind of illness that I haven't taken account of? But in the end, he actually couldn't explain it in normal psychiatric terms or psychiatric diagnosis. So he kept doing the hypnosis on her, and she just kept getting better. And she would go back into these past lives that were just fascinating, and the result was that she was getting better. What also happened during that was that she then started talking about things to do with him and about the death of a very young child that he had, that he'd always been very sad about. And it was a young child, I think, only weeks old, who had an abnormal heart problem. And in this, I think the patient was called Catherine in the book, and when she was in a hypnotic state, she would then describe exactly what had happened to this child, and none of that information was available. This was before the days of Google or anything like that. So there's no way that she could have known the details of his son or the medical problems related to his son. And she even gave him, talked about his name, which was a very specific family Jewish name. And that it was things like that I think Brian, in the end, just couldn't ignore at all. So he wrote.
You found yourself. Yeah, and you found yourself in a similar situation. How did the shift go in your own mind from where you were as a young doctor to having to accept some of this evidence that you saw and then kind of wrap new beliefs around it, or new perspectives or new understandings around it? How did that shift go for you in your mind?
That's a really good question, because in the end, I for some time, I remained, skeptical. Because you're really, your thinking is very hardwired, and you're constantly getting, I suppose, reinforced in your daily life. The idea that everything here is real, and that's all there is. And of course, my sense of self, if you like, my identity, was very attached to being a doctor and a psychiatrist, and so there was this sort of battle going on in my mind as I was reading more and listening to friends and patients about their stories. Was this actually possible, or was it not possible? Was I? So I kind of, I still remained skeptical for a while, even though I was reading, these extraordinary stories, like some of the ones I've told you. And I suppose I talk about that in the book, that process of trying to reconcile these things. But in the end, I just couldn't ignore it. It was kind of overwhelming for me. Because I had patients who were talking about their deceased relatives visiting them. I'll tell you this one story because it was quite funny. I was playing golf with friends over in New Zealand with a couple of other psychiatrists, and we got to a place called Queenstown in New Zealand. It's very beautiful, and we quickly played 9 holes of golf that night, and then went to bed, having not watched any television or anything. We got up the next morning, and one of the psychiatrists said, "Oh man, I had this really weird dream last night, where I was looking out of the hotel window, and there was this sort of 2-story wave of water coming at me." And he said it completely freaked him out. So, he got out of bed and went to the toilet. And my other psychiatrist friend said, "Yeah, man, I had a very weird dream as well, where I was trying to put out these fires, but they weren't normal fires. They were a funny colour, and I just couldn't put them out. They were everywhere." So they said, "Did you have a dream?" And I said, "No, I got nothing." So we went off and played golf that day, and when we got back from the golf, we looked up at the television screen on the in the clubhouse, and there that night had been the tsunami in Asia and Japan, and the meltdown of the Fukushima power plant, and at the time, and I'd already been reading about all of these things at that stage. So I remember looking at the other two and going, "Oh my God, you guys have somehow tapped into that collective consciousness." And one of them was pretty dismissive, but the other one, I have to be fair, he over time he became more and more accepting, and he started reading about these things. I think when he read Eben Alexander's book, Proof of Heaven, which was his personal description of a near-death experience. For him, that got him over the edge. But all of these things were happening, Stuart, and I was increasingly, just starting to realise that I couldn't ignore it, and I had to take it on. And I started doing hypnosis on to start with. I actually did it on a friend of my wife's. She said, "Oh, look, I'm interested in that kind of thing, and I'm happy to be John's guinea pig." And I'd again quite probably not coincidentally. I don't think anything's coincidence anymore. Psychiatrists aren't normally taught hypnosis anymore. It's more the domain of psychologists, if you like. But I'd been taught hypnosis in my final year of training, just because I was at a particular hospital where the hypnosis training was the organisation in Victoria was happening. So I'd actually learned hypnosis. So I ended up doing it on this friend of my wife, and she was a fantastic hypnotic subject. She would go into a really deep state, and she then she went back into past lives, in ancient Egypt and American Civil War, and as a merchant, in the northern China, Elizabethan period. She was quite extraordinary.
Wow.
And she was shocked by it in the end. But again, the detail, the emotion that would be attached to the experiences that she would describe were quite extraordinary. And there was just no sense that she was making it up or imagining it or contriving it. So that was for me quite profound. And in the end, what happened was that she, after she was in the hypnotic state and she'd described dying, I think it was an ancient Greek life actually, and she died, and what would happen is she'd then go up into this sort of between lives realm, or spirit state, or whatever people want to call it. And she would describe how beautiful that was, and that she would meet other souls and souls that she reincarnated with before, and things like that. But then she went into this, it was like she was going into this special room, and she described she couldn't actually explain it, and then she just suddenly started talking to me as if she was someone else, and she said, "Well, I've got a message for the man sitting opposite me," and it was, her voice changed. It was quite bizarre. It was a bit freaky for me too. And she said, this is to tell you that your life is very different now. It's all very, it'll be fine. I've written the details of that because at this stage I was recording all the hypnosis sessions, so I could transcribe everything. What was fascinating, so in the end they were basically telling me to keep going down this path, and this can be useful for patients, and it sounds very, people could dismiss it, but in the end it was really quite extraordinary. And what was interesting is that Jenny, she's called, she when she came out of it, in the past she'd always remembered her past lives, because I'd say, "Look, you'll remember all the details," and she'd remember them. Mm-hmm. But this bit where she was somehow, it was like this higher being was talking to me, she had absolutely no memory of it. So that was fairly extraordinary. So then I started, there were a few patients that had near-death experiences, and I chose to, and I spoke to them and said, look, and they'd been unwell and were still struggling, and I said, would you be interested to do a past life regression, hypnosis? And both of them were very interested to do that. So and both of them, again, perhaps not coincidentally, were good hypnotic subjects, and both of them went into past lives that were really quite extraordinary. Again, with amazing detail and emotion that you just, in the end, you sit back and you just go, there's no sense that they were making it up or imagining it. It was too spontaneous. Clear. And I think in the book I said the thing that finally got me over the line was with one of these patients. I ended up doing the hypnosis, and she actually rang me after because she'd been very well after all of that, and she rang and said, look, can I just do one more past life regression? It feels like it's important. So I said, yeah, sure. And she went back to this life. And she and again, all of this was recorded, so the transcript's in the book. And she said, look, I'm outside. It's really hot, and I'm wearing a long dress from neck down to my feet, and I'm picking vegetables. And she was giving all the details of what was happening. And I live in this big house with pillars, and it's white, and but it's very hot. And then she went inside, and there was a cook who was cooking at the time, and the cook told her off because she shouldn't be outside in the heat because she was very pregnant. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, this is probably something to do with the southern states of America. So that was what came to my mind because it was so hot. The cook was olive-skinned, I think, not dark-skinned. And I said to her, look, what time is this? What date is it? And she paused for a moment. She said, it's 1878. And she said, I know that because it's my 20th birthday today. That's why the cook's here. We're having a lot of friends over for a party. And I said, well, where is this? Where do you live? And again, she paused for a moment and said, Cape May. And now, for an Australian, they'll be different for an American, but for an Australian, we wouldn't have a clue where Cape May was. I had no idea when she said that, and I said, okay. And she said, oh, look, we don't live in town. We live in, we live in an estate outside of town. And then, as you do in those situations, I said, look, just go forward to another important time in that lifetime. And she suddenly said, oh my God, there's been a huge fire. Half of the town's been burnt down. We're trying to help friends. My husband's works with a lot of the businessmen there, and they've been very affected, and we're trying to help them. My baby's been born, so we're okay. Anyway, she went. The rest of the life was pretty uneventful. Her husband died from TB, I think, but it moved on. Now, I asked her at the end of that session. I said, "Well, do you know where Cape May is?" And she said, "Well, if it exists now, I wouldn't have a clue. Maybe it just existed back then." And so I thought, okay, well, that's interesting. I probably won't ever find out. Well, I went home that night, and my brother and sister-in-law were with us, and my sister-in-law jumped on the computer, and there it was in 1878 in Cape May. A third of the town was burnt down. And for me, that is the first time I'd had a past life regression where there was that level of validation. And for, clearly she knew nothing about it, and she's as honest as the day is long. She's a lovely lady, and I had no idea. Now, Americans may well know where Cape May is, but Australians wouldn't have a clue. So for me, that was kind of a bit the deal breaker, and I thought, no, I really can't ignore any of this anymore. I have to pursue it, and that's when I started using the hypnosis on Judy. The main character. book, and that, you know, she happened to also be an excellent hypnotic subject, and she went back into a variety of different past lives, you know, in Spain, you know, in the 16th century, and again America on a couple of occasions, probably 1800s, you know, to England and France. And there's I won't. It's a bit of a spoiler if I tell the story, but what happened was her life in France was she was male. Now, this Judy had an appalling upbringing. She had the most awful upbringing, and she was barely educated. And again, that's in the book, but I won't go into the details of that. But she was very uneducated, but not unintelligent. But she'd done no reading on the whole subject, so she went into this past life in France where she was a male, and she was helping to rescue people from soldiers. I think it was probably around the First World War, and they were hiding these people under their floorboards. Now, eventually, what happened was that soldiers obviously found out and shot him, or, you know, her in that past life as a male, and then shot the wife and the children. And I was a bit shocked. I thought, oh my goodness, I've traumatized her. You know, this is she's had enough trauma in her life without me doing that to her. And when she came out of the hypnosis, you know, can I use colourful language?
Sure.
Her first words were that she looked at me and she said, "What the fuck?" She said, "You didn't tell me I could be male." So she was completely gobsmacked. She just presumed that if she had past lives, that she would be that she'd be female. So she was, you know, that just knocked her around quite a lot. When she went back into her Spanish life, you know, she was describing the frills on the neck of the gentry at that time, and I think it was 1500s, and she described a game that she was playing that was now what's the where you put pegs in the board. Oh my God, I can't think of the name at the moment. I've written it down here somewhere. But she also described the shape of the helmets that the soldiers were wearing at that time. And she was using her hands. This is in the hypnotic state. She was describing the curved helmets that then, you know, pointed up. And she afterwards she said, yeah, "Look, you know, John, I wouldn't have a clue. Would that be right?" And in the end, I Googled it, and yes, the helmets of Spanish soldiers in those days were exactly that. They were they curved up into a point. So that was also quite extraordinary. So what happened over time? It didn't happen overnight, but over time, doing those regressions on her became enormously helpful. It just it gave her a different view of life, and
right.
And she also went into these. Can I keep talking? Is that it's
let's do a little pivot here and give me some perspective, if you would, on how you see consciousness now. So, I mean, there's a lot of stories you've heard here that are really impressive and obviously gave you a new look at it. And I don't know if it was in the beginning of our conversation or if it was before we actually started. You mentioned how your perspective on consciousness shifted from, you know, it being with all produced by the brain to a different model. So if you wouldn't mind sharing, you know, from all these amazing stories, the shift in your view and how you would define or even look at consciousness as a result of that.
Yeah, so I would now have it completely on its head. I would argue that consciousness comes first. That in the end, that consciousness, if you like, precedes matter, and that our consciousness, or that broader universal consciousness, whatever you want to call it, is the thing that has manifest this world and all the physical aspects of it and the time aspects of it. So now I would have it completely the other way around, very much along the lines of what Mark Gober was talking about, that somehow there is a universal consciousness that we're all connected as part of that, in a way that's nearly impossible to properly describe or explain. But that in a sense we're all very, very connected and part of that. I love the metaphor of that we're all ice blocks, and Brian Weiss sort of talks about this, that somehow we're in this physical state. It's like we're ice blocks, and we're all, different shapes. Some of us are square and some of us are oblong and some of us are circular and some of us are funny shapes. Yeah. And we all look at each other and go, well, check them out. They've got funny edges, or they've got, a few air bubbles in them. And so, and a sense that we're all separate. But if you raise the temperature and you raise the vibration of those ice blocks, they melt and all become part of the same body of water. A little bit like Bernardo Kastrup when he talked about, we're all part of the same stream. We've just got little different eddies within that stream.
Yeah.
And then if you raise the temperature, vibration of that body of water, it becomes vapor. It becomes gas. And then if you raise that even higher, you get separation of molecules. And if you raise it even higher, you get separation of the individual atoms. So that somehow, that's for me, that's the metaphor, that in the end, there is a consciousness and a connectedness that we're part of. That can't be completely explained, and that goes way beyond our capacity to explain it with our current science. There's no doubt that quantum physics is starting to look at some of that stuff. The string theory and the connectedness, the idea that consciousness can change outcomes. The slit experiments of Dean Radin and the like, and the idea that time is an illusion. That as Einstein said, that time's just a stubbornly persistent illusion, and that it may well not exist at that higher consciousness level. So the and I'm no expert in quantum physics, but at all, but those kind of elements of the quantum exploration are really interested in, and they certainly parallel the idea that consciousness is certainly goes beyond our brain. So yes, it really is on its head now. I believe that there's a consciousness, that a universal consciousness, if you like, and I think, again, without getting too spiritual or too, my sense is that universal consciousness is something very lovely, very wonderful. The passion that people talk about when they have their near-death experiences, and the sense of peace and well-being and profound love is quite extraordinary. And I think one of your guests, I think it was Pim Van Lommel it might have been Mark Gober again, talking about, the people doing past life reviews and the sense of peace and joy and understanding the importance of looking after each other. Those things are, I think, are part of that consciousness. And in the end, some people will call it, that universal consciousness in the end becomes, God or the divine or all that is, or source. And for me, it doesn't matter what words you use, but that's I think that there's a lot of that's my sense of it, that universal consciousness that precedes this world of form and time is something quite marvelous, something quite wonderful. But it's tough because we're down here in this paradigm, and it's quite extraordinary. And I'm still working pretty much full time, and I see lots of patients who are struggling with all the elements of our current lives. So while it's lovely to contemplate all of those things, that it's not always easy to apply those to our current our current lives. So as a psychiatrist, I mean, there are movements that would say you don't need medication, and if you just get your head into the right space, everything will be lovely, everything will be wonderful. But that's a lot easier said than done. So
Right.
As a psychiatrist, while I love the idea of doing past life regressions, and I will do it if I think it's appropriate, and if people have had quite profound psychic experiences or near-death experiences, or if I think it's really helpful, and but in other cases, I'm still treating them with antidepressants and still doing the normal therapies that we do. So it's almost like I have to keep two sets of books. I've got the my view of consciousness and the fact that this is in a sense is almost not the real world. The real world is that primary universal consciousness. But at the same time, I'm living in this paradigm and this world, so I've got to make the most of it. And I think that's what we've all got to do. We've got to do our very best to enjoy it and make the most. Which is why I love your podcast. I think it's fantastic. It's which is why I wrote the book. It's to encourage people to think outside the square and contemplate the idea that there just is more to us. And in the end, when you start reading about it and start exploring it, it really is nearly impossible to ignore. What's interesting, and I will say, a couple of people I've spoken to recently who've read the book or talked about it, and they say, I believe what you're saying, and I kind of believe that people have those experiences, and I kind of get that therefore there must be a consciousness that goes beyond the brain or that's outside of it, but it freaks me out. It's too scary. So I just don't go there. And I think that's true. I think, for a lot of us, for me, it took me a while. It took me a while to get my head around it and to get comfortable with it and to, challenge my old ideas and my sense of identity as a psychiatrist. But in the end, I couldn't ignore it. But I completely understand when people say, no, that's too freaky, that's too odd, and I can't.
There's two sides. There's two sides of the pushback, it seems. There's the scientific medical side, and then there's the spiritual religious side that don't want to accept some of these things.
Exactly. No, that's perfectly put. And and yet, the science is starting to quietly move in that direction. Even psychedelics, that's fascinating as well. And I think in the next 10 years you'll find that psychedelics are being used to treat depression and post-traumatic stress disorder and people with profound fear of death. So I think that's very likely. But to get that done, the people who research that stuff, they won't talk about it in spiritual terms. They'll talk about it in biological terms. So they'll still mostly attempt to explain it in terms of the function of the brain. But my hunch is that the psychedelics, we're tapping into a sort of spiritual plane again, a broader consciousness that again then provides people with information or an understanding or a belief that is really helpful for them. So, but you're right. I mean, even within the medical and scientific fraternity, to get funding, you've still somehow got to put it in ways that seem to be that fit with the old science. And yet I think a lot of that will be, exploring something that relates more to the broader consciousness and those issues. So, So it's, there are lots of, I always like quoting the Professor Nutt from Imperial College in London. He's a neuropsychopharmacologist, and when people have psychedelics, because I think there's a lot of similarities between psychedelics, people having near-death experiences, and people when they're in a deep hypnotic state. They've done fMRIs, the functional MRIs, so they watch the brain operating when they're having the psychedelics. And what they first expected was that the brain would light up with all these fantastic visual experiences and emotional experiences, that the brain would sort of light up. And in fact, it's the opposite. The brain actually, if anything, winds down, and the major control centers of the brain, if anything, slow down. So it's almost as if you're slowing the brain down in order that it can tap into that bigger bandwidth. It can tap into that sort of consciousness that goes. And I think that's probably what hypnosis does. Hypnosis is simply focused concentration. It's just getting you into a very focused state where you're shutting off the rest of the brain and stopping that from interfering with your thinking. So it's a very sort of focused state. And I think that when people go into a very deep focused state, they have the capacity to tap into a consciousness that is outside their brains, that goes beyond them. I mean, we all have them. I mean, when you're driving the car and you suddenly think, holy mackerel, I haven't been paying attention the last kilometre. I've got no idea what was happening.
Right.
That's a classic sort of trance state, because your brain's been thinking about something else. Your body's been still driving the car, but your brain has been somewhere else. So we all have the capacity to go into those kind of trance states. And again,
and
yeah, sure.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
And one thing I find interesting when you're talking about this is two or three concepts you've mentioned is, the past life regressions, and obviously there is memories to be tapped into. Yep. And then you mentioned, I think, something like the between life state, yep, that you're in between two different lives. And then you also mentioned reincarnation. So I wonder what your opinion is of consciousness, because sometimes when you talk about a universal consciousness, it's almost as if you're talking about, quantum matter, quantum particles, quantum waves that are creating, our existence. But some of the things you're talking about imply that there is an individual, an identity within that universal consciousness that is pulled in by this filter brain, the radio receiver brain, of different bodies at different times. But when it's pulled out of that body, it still retains some memories from all that. So it's almost like it's one entity that comes in and has multiple experiences in these things I call meat bags, right? That it comes down and taps into that. Is that kind of your view of what's going on?
Yeah, look, that's just a great question, because it's so, when I start getting into the detail, it's so hard to put it all together. Yes, I do think people are in that hypnotic state that are tapping into a memory of a previous life, and it's probably a previous life that's connected to them, and that we've got all of these. We've all got a soul, if you like. We've all got a spirit or a soul, and that soul has lived, many lives and may well live future lives. But then, and some people might argue that in fact, in the hypnotic state, you're just tapping into a collective consciousness, that it's not your past life, that it's a more specific. But that doesn't quite ring true. Ian Stevenson, who did a lot of work with children, and their memories of past life. And I haven't talked about that, but his work is extraordinary. I mean, he was the University of Virginia and worked with a lot of people, Poetic Institute and things like that. And the hard thing about his work is he was so scrupulous with what he did. Reading his work is sometimes quite difficult, but he investigated some nearly 3,000 children who were talking about their past lives. And what was fascinating about his work was that, he would, in some cases, the children would, talk about some 15 or 16 specific details, and he would then be able to go and verify the majority of those details of a person that had lived, 20 or 40 years ago. So it's quite spectacular. But some of those children had birthmarks, and he was able to then, he discovered that the means by which the person had died in the previous life, which and the child usually didn't remember that, but he would discover it when he was doing his research. The means by which was the reason they had the birthmark. One child had a depigmentation in its chest, a circular area of depigmentation, and he discovered that in that past life, when he researched it and found, that particular person, that he'd accidentally died from a gunshot wound to his chest. So there's a sense that I might be a bit all over the shop, but it's really hard to. There's a sense that consciousness or that awareness is transmitted into the next life, in the same way that people, bring in their phobias and their fears from something that's happened in a previous life. So I think I think it all operates in layers. Yes, we have souls. Yes, we have past lives. Yes, we have future lives. That's what I believe. But in the end, all of us, like the ice cubes, in the end, are actually part of something even bigger. And that's the best way I can put it. So it's like it's operating at different levels. When we're down here at this level, that we're the meat bags and we're, doing our best. But yes, we can tap into other lives that we've lived. And I think we have and have future lives. And between those lives, there is this spirit world where, we communicate with telepathy and we choose our lives, which a lot of my patients don't like the idea of, because that, but the idea that we would even choose our lives. And that's kind of at a higher level. And then, but I suspect in the end, there are higher levels again, and that we're all somehow connected to those even higher levels. It sounds very spiritual, and I suspect it is. But there are different sort of layers or levels of that consciousness. And down here we're the meat bags, and sometimes we can tap into that consciousness of our souls and other lives and between lives in that spirit state. But I suspect that there are higher levels again, and that in the end we're part of that. That our consciousness, our soul, is part of that at an even higher level. That's the best way I can put it. It's really hard to explain that. It's really, really, really tricky. But that I think that connectedness in the end is ongoing. It's hard. People don't like the idea of losing their individuality. So that idea that somehow we connect up almost completely and become part of one consciousness is a bit scary. So again, another reason why it's a bit easier to avoid all of that. But I think that's probably in the end what happens. We're all part of that universal consciousness, which is at an even higher level. But in between, whilst there are meat bags here and past lives and then the spirit state, which is what I think people with near-death experiences are tapping into, that lovely kind of loving. And that's what so the near-death experiences are very, very similar to what people describe under hypnosis when they die and then go into that spirit state. They describe the same thing. They'll describe a beautiful light, describe a wonderful feeling of calm and peace and love, and then meeting up with other dead relatives, people that have died, and connecting with them. With a sense of no judgment, with a sense that everything's fine, everything is as it's meant to be. So
wow.
I explained gave the answer, but that's as best as I can do.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic.
Yeah. But I do think go for it.
No, what do you think?
No, I was going to say I do think those the near-death experiences and the psychedelics and the hypnosis in some way are doing something similar. They're switching off the busy brain and allowing us to tap into to a higher consciousnness, and that fascinates me. So I do think the next major shift in science will be to do with consciousness. I think one of your speakers talked about Max Planck and one of his sayings. But my favourite saying of Max Planck, who was the Nobel Prize winner physicist,
right.
he said, "Science changes funeral by funeral," and I kind of like that. It's really hard for us to let go of our current paradigms and the way we see things. And look, in talking about all of the psychic stuff as well, it's really, there are charlatans out there. There are people who are pretending to be mediums and they're not. There are people who are saying they're psychics and are going to tell, and there are charlatans. But that, for me, and that's what people often go to because they're fearful of this stuff and they think it's all a bit too, it's too hard to believe. They'll quote those kind of people on the charlatans. But that doesn't mean people like, John Edward or Laura Lynn Jackson or Deborah Diamond, I think they're the real deal. They're legit.
Right.
So that, so if you've got people who are who are faking it or are charlatans, that doesn't mean the others aren't real. So, and for me, that
diverse attention away.
Exactly.
Yeah,
so,
excellent. What else? Anything else about consciousness specifically before I ask you kind of what's coming next from you? Is there anything else you want to get out from all of this related to consciousness specifically?
No, I think I think in the end, the consciousness is something so expansive and so extraordinary that it goes way beyond anything that our current science can tap into and maybe we'll ever be able to properly tap into. And that's what makes it so hard. But I do think we have the potential to explore it, in ways and understand it a whole lot better than we do. And I do think that will be the next major shift in science. But it will happen slowly. And I'm hopeful that things like past life regressions can become part of psychiatry. It's like anything, any form of treatment. It can be used properly or it can be used poorly. So I think used properly and appropriately, it can be really, really helpful. Look, there's more I could talk about. Brian Weiss used to do these psychometric exercises with big groups. They'd go into a light hypnotic state and focus on the person next to them, and they come up with information as a result of that. Then it would be a person they didn't know at all. Someone that they were at a and it's quite, there was one particular one I remember which he quotes. So you'd get an object from the person next door. They might give you a ring or a watch and you'd focus on that and go into a sort of a light hypnotic trance, but really focus on that. And then at the end of that, he'd get you to talk to each other and say, well, what came up, what things did you experience? And it could be anything at all. And he'd say to the people, he'd say, just, don't hold back. If something came to you, just mention it. And there's a classic one where the woman said, well, I had the ring of the lady next to me. I've never met her before. But when I was focusing on that ring and focusing on her, I just kept getting 3 little pigs coming into my brain. It just, she said, it was a bit embarrassing, but because you said I have to say it, I told her, that I just kept getting 3 little pigs. And of course, when she told, the woman burst into tears because her father, who had recently deceased, had given her a little statue of 3 little pigs, which she had held on to and had great sentimental value. So, there are lots of lovely stories. So for me, at the moment, in terms of shifting that thinking, it is that willingness to look at those stories and say, well, we can't explain them. We can't explain them by current science. But the fact that we can't explain them, it doesn't mean they don't exist. It's best not to discuss it. We've got to and not to be freaked out by that, not to be scared of it. And all of my senses and everything I've, in terms of people near-death experiences and is that it's something quite lovely. It's not something to be frightened of. It's something that's quite wonderful, but we've got a long way to go in terms of understanding it.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that people like you are taking a look at it and sharing these experiences, because we can't just say no to it. We got to take a look and just see what it means. So I'm really grateful for all the work you do and all the information you share, and even more grateful that you were willing to come here and talk to me about this. So thank you very much, Dr. Weber.
My absolute pleasure, Stuart.
That concludes another edition of the Consciousness Podcast. Thanks again for listening. Please find us at Facebook at facebook.com/The Consciousness Podcast, at our Twitter handle at Conchcast, and don't forget to subscribe to our feed at theconsciousnesspodcast.com. Thank you for listening.